There are places in this world that were never meant for the living. Houses that don't just hold memories, they hold hunger. Tonight, I'll tell you the story of Daniel, a man who thought he found a quiet place to live, but instead stepped into something much darker. A house that whispered, a house that shifted, a house that consumed. And as you listen, ask yourself, what would you do if the very walls around you weren't just watching, but waiting? On the far edge of Blackwood Hill, where the town lights faded into silence and the road narrowed into cracked pavement, stood an old rental house. It wasn't large, but it was cheap. Cheap enough to draw the attention of Daniel Harper, a man in his late 20s who had recently moved out of the city in search of peace. From the outside, the house looked ordinary. White paint flaking from its wooden siding, a crooked mailbox leaning toward the street, windows covered by dusty curtains that hadn't been touched in years. Behind it, thick woods loomed like a dark wall, casting shadows that seemed to linger even during the day. The landlord was quick to hand over the keys. No paperwork delays, no endless questions, just a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and the words, "Take care of the place." When Daniel moved in, he expected loneliness. He expected silence. What he didn't expect were the stares. The neighbors across the street, an elderly couple who spent most of their time on the porch, stared openly as he carried boxes inside. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace until the animal began whining, tugging her away from the house. Even children, riding bikes along the cracked sidewalks, stopped to look, whispering something Daniel couldn't hear. That first night, Daniel lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar stillness. It wasn't like the city where noise filled every gap. Here, silence had weight. It pressed against the windows, seeped through the walls, and settled into the floorboards. But silence, he realized, was never truly empty. Just after midnight, he woke to the sound of something faint, like footsteps moving across the wooden floor downstairs. He froze, listening. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was the house settling, he thought. Old wood always creaked at night. Still, unease settled in his stomach. He locked his bedroom door before trying to fall back asleep. The following day, Daniel decided to introduce himself to the neighbors. He walked across the street, offering a smile to the elderly couple. "Morning," he greeted. "I just moved in across the road." The old man didn't smile back. His cloudy eyes shifted toward the house, then back to Daniel. His voice was rough, as though he hadn't used it in a while. "You won't stay." Daniel blinked. "Sorry?" The man's wife touched his arm sharply, shaking her head. "Don't mind him," she said quickly. "Welcome to the neighborhood." But even as she spoke, her eyes never left the house behind Daniel. That evening, Daniel unpacked a few boxes. The air inside the house was always cold, even though late summer still clung to the town outside. He turned on the heater, but it rattled uselessly. The cold seemed rooted deeper than pipes or insulation. It came from the walls themselves. Around 9 p.m., while setting up his small kitchen, he heard something again. A faint scratching. It came from the back hallway where a narrow door stood at the end. Daniel hadn't opened it yet. He assumed it led to a basement, though the landlord hadn't mentioned one. The scratching was faint, irregular, like nails dragging across wood. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and walked down the hall. The sound stopped when he reached the door. He jiggled the handle. Locked. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the old brass knob before forcing a laugh. "Probably mice," he muttered, though the words didn't feel convincing even to himself. Still, as he turned away, a chill ran down his spine. From behind the door came a single, deliberate knock. By the third night, Daniel hadn't slept well. Dreams twisted into half-heard whispers, faces in the dark corners of his room. Shadows lingered too long, stretching unnaturally when headlights passed the windows. While lying awake close to 2 a.m., he heard it again, footsteps downstairs. This time clearer, heavier, moving from the kitchen to the living room. Daniel sat up, heart pounding. He grabbed the flashlight again and crept down the stairs. The rooms were empty. But when he returned to the hallway, the locked door stood slightly ajar. He hadn't opened it. He was certain. Shining his light inside, he saw only the top of a staircase leading into blackness. The air pouring out was damp, icy, carrying the stench of earth and mildew. And somewhere below, in that darkness, something breathed. Slow. Heavy. As if waiting for him to step closer. Daniel slammed the door shut, heart hammering, and slid the deadbolt back into place. From that night forward, he started keeping count of every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement, because he knew the house was not empty, and whatever lived beneath it had just realized he was there. Daniel avoided the basement door for the rest of the night. He sat in his bedroom with the lamp on until the sun rose, trying to convince himself that what he had heard, the breathing, the knock, was nothing more than his imagination twisting ordinary sounds. But in his gut he knew better. The next morning he forced himself back into routine. Coffee. A quick breakfast. Unpacking the last of his belongings. Yet as the hours passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him. The strange part wasn't just the noises or the cold air anymore. It was the way time seemed to move differently inside. Minutes stretched into hours when he was downstairs, but the clock barely shifted whenever he was in the kitchen or living room. Upstairs, time sped up. He'd close his eyes for what felt like seconds and open them to find nearly an hour gone. By the afternoon, Daniel walked into town for supplies. The grocery store was small, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. As he picked up essentials, he overheard two cashiers whispering when they saw him. One muttered something about the Hill House, while the other shushed her quickly. Their eyes followed him the entire time he stood at the register. On his way back, he stopped at a corner diner. The waitress, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, perked up when he mentioned where he lived. "You're staying up there?" she asked, lowering her voice. "On Blackwood Hill?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, cheap rent." The smile on her face vanished. She leaned closer. "Don't go near the basement." Before he could ask more, another customer entered and she hurried away. That night, Daniel sat in the living room, determined not to let paranoia control him. He turned on the television for background noise. The glow of the screen filled the room with a comforting light, and for a while, it felt almost normal. But then he noticed something odd. Every reflection in the glass, coffee table, window, even the black sheen of the TV screen itself, showed him sitting there on the couch. Except in the reflection of the window where he wasn't alone. Behind him, just barely visible, stood a figure. Tall, thin, motionless. Daniel spun around. Nothing was there. When he turned back to the window, the reflection was empty again. Later, as he lay in bed, Daniel tried to ignore the sounds that had become part of every night. Soft thuds from the floorboards, faint whispers brushing along the walls. He buried his head under the blanket like a child, willing himself to sleep. Around 3 a.m. he woke suddenly, heart racing. He didn't know why at first. The room was quiet. Then he heard it. From downstairs. The door. The basement door. It was creaking open. Slowly. He held his breath, staring at the hallway outside his bedroom. He couldn't see the bottom of the stairs from his room, but he could hear it. The dragging of footsteps on the floor below. Heavy, uneven, as though whoever, or whatever, it was hadn't walked in a long time. For nearly an hour, Daniel sat frozen in bed, too terrified to move. The footsteps never reached the stairs. They circled below, pacing, pausing, then starting again. Finally, silence. When the morning came, Daniel went downstairs. The basement door was shut again, locked tight as if it had never been touched. But across the dusty wooden floor of the hallway, faint tracks remained. Smudges shaped like long, bare feet, leading away from the basement and disappearing halfway into the living room. Over the following days, Daniel tried to keep busy, but the unease grew worse. Objects shifted when he wasn't looking. A mug moved from counter to sink. Books leaned at angles he hadn't left them. At night, the lights flickered and buzzed, sometimes going dark for several minutes before sputtering back. More than once, he caught the faint smell of damp earth upstairs, as though the air from the basement had followed him to bed. The neighbors kept watching too. One afternoon, the same old man from across the street shouted as Daniel unloaded groceries. "Get out while you can." His wife yanked him back inside, slamming the door, but the words rang in Daniel's ears all evening. That night, determined to prove to himself there was a logical explanation, Daniel set up his phone to record audio by the basement door. He pressed record and went to bed. The next morning he replayed the file. For the first 2 hours, silence. Then faint scratching. A knock. And then a voice. Low, gravelly, impossible to make out fully, but clear enough to chill Daniel to his core. It said his name. Daniel? By the end of the first week, Daniel realized something undeniable. The house was alive. Not just haunted, alive. Breathing. Watching. And whatever waited in that basement had no intention of staying hidden forever. The house sat in silence, yet silence was the one thing absent. From the very moment Daniel moved in, he knew something wasn't right. At first, the sounds were small, barely noticeable, like the gentle creak of wood expanding in the night or the distant hum of pipes. He brushed them off, convincing himself it was just an old house settling. But these sounds carried rhythm. They had intention. It started with whispers. Not loud enough to make out words, but soft enough to crawl beneath the skin. They always came when Daniel was alone, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. He'd wake to the faint, rasping murmur of voices, sometimes behind the walls, sometimes just above his ceiling, as though someone were standing in the attic, muttering to themselves. Every time he got up to investigate, the voices stopped instantly, leaving him staring into the oppressive stillness. One night he tried to record the noises. He placed his phone on the nightstand, microphone on, and drifted off to a restless sleep. When he played it back in the morning, he expected static or maybe the faint groans of the house. But what he heard made his stomach turn cold. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the recording picked up a voice. This time it wasn't muffled. It was clear. A deep, gravelly whisper that breathed right into the microphone as though leaning close to his sleeping body. It said, "You can't ignore us forever, Daniel." The recording ended in silence. No footsteps. No shuffling. Just that single sentence directed at him. Daniel didn't sleep the next night. He sat awake in bed with every light in the house on, his eyes darting at shadows shifting across the floorboards. At one point, around the same cursed hour, he swore he saw a figure at the corner of his bedroom, standing motionless, watching. But the moment he blinked, it was gone. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself that sleep deprivation was playing tricks on his mind. He even deleted the recording as though erasing the file could erase what he heard. But the house was not done with it. The following evening, Daniel heard scratching. It was faint at first, coming from behind the walls in the hallway. Long, deliberate scratches like nails dragging across plaster. The sound grew louder, moving from one wall to another, until it seemed to circle him as he stood frozen in the hallway. He slammed his fists against the wall, shouting at whatever was inside, but the scratching stopped instantly, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Breathless and trembling, he pressed his ear against the wall, trying to catch even the faintest sound. For a moment there was nothing. And then, right on the other side of the thin plaster, came 3 knocks. Knock, 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 slow, intentional, as if something was answering him back. Daniel stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He locked himself in his room and shoved a chair under the doorknob, though deep down he knew it was pointless. If something had already made its way into his home, into his walls, how long until it made its way into him? The next few nights blurred together in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. He stopped sleeping entirely, too afraid of what he might hear if he let his guard down. The whispers grew bolder, the scratching more constant, until the house itself seemed to breathe with a life of its own. And then came the night Daniel swore he felt a hand brush against his leg as he sat alone in the living room. Not a trick of fabric, not the brush of imagination, but cold, clammy fingers curling ever so slightly against his skin. He bolted upright, scanning the room, but no one was there. Just the faint echo of a laugh, low, guttural, and mocking, seeping from the darkness of the hallway. It was in that moment Daniel realized, the house wasn't haunted by something that wanted to scare him. No, wanted him. And it was only just beginning. Daniel's descent into fear was no longer just about shadows and whispers. The house had begun to feed on him, on his mind, his body, his very will. Sleep-deprived and weak, he could feel his grip on reality slipping. Every creak of the floorboards made him jump, every brush of air across his skin felt like unseen fingers, and every shadow seemed to linger a little too long. By the 4th week in the house, Daniel barely recognized himself. His eyes were ringed with dark circles, his voice had gone hoarse from screaming into empty rooms, and his body twitched involuntarily from the constant state of adrenaline. He wasn't living in the house anymore, he was surviving it. One evening, desperate to confront whatever plagued him, Daniel decided to set up cameras. He placed 3 old security cams around the house. One in the living room, one in the hallway where the scratching often came, and one in his bedroom. He sat awake all night, staring at the monitors, daring the house to reveal itself. At 3:12 a.m., the hallway camera caught something. The scratching began again, loud enough to rattle the thin walls. Daniel's eyes darted to the monitor, where he saw the shadows shift unnaturally. It wasn't a trick of the light, it was darker than the shadows should have been, coiling and stretching like smoke. And then, right in the middle of the hallway, the shadow stood up. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even human. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its head brushing the ceiling. Its limbs stretched too far, bending in jagged angles as if broken but still moving. It turned slowly toward the camera. No face, no features, just a black void where a face should be. And then it raised its hand. 3 fingers extended. And it knocked on the wall beside the camera. 1, 2, 3. Daniel felt his blood freeze as the sound of the knocks echoed through his actual hallway at the exact same time. He bolted from his chair, ripped the cameras from their cords and smashed them onto the floor. But the house only seemed to laugh at his defiance. That night he dreamed, or thought he dreamed, of being dragged through the walls. He could feel the plaster breaking apart as skeletal hands pulled him inside, his screams muffled by layers of wood and dust. When he woke up, his arms and chest were covered in long, jagged scratches, as though he had really been clawing his way out of something. The line between dream and waking life had shattered. Desperate, Daniel called a priest, an old family contact. The man came reluctantly, stepping into the house with heavy hesitation, clutching a small cross. He walked through each room, murmuring prayers, sprinkling holy water. Daniel followed him closely, clinging to the hope that this nightmare could end. But when they reached the upstairs hallway, the priest froze. His lips trembled, his hands shook. He turned to Daniel with eyes wide in terror and whispered, "This is not a house. It is a mouth. And it's hungry." Before Daniel could respond, a deafening bang erupted from inside the walls. Then another. The house shook violently, dust pouring from the ceiling as if something enormous was moving just beneath the surface. The priest dropped his cross and bolted out of the house, refusing to step foot inside again. Daniel was left alone, trembling in the dim light, the walls groaning around him like a beast stirring in its sleep. He realized then that whatever haunted the house wasn't something that could be banished with holy words or water. It was older. It was patient. And it was claiming him piece by piece. That night, when Daniel finally collapsed into a restless sleep, he heard the whispers again. This time they weren't coming from the walls or the attic. They were coming from inside his own head. And in the chorus of voices that hissed and echoed through his skull, one stood out above the rest. "You live in us now, Daniel. And soon, we will live in you." By now, Daniel no longer thought of the house as a building. It wasn't walls and wood anymore. It was alive, breathing, shifting, watching. Every step he took echoed back at him, as if the house was repeating his movements. Every corner he turned seemed slightly different than before, as though the very geometry of the place was warping to trap him. One morning he tried to leave. He stuffed a bag with clothes, grabbed his car keys and stormed out the front door. But when he stepped onto the porch, something was wrong. The world outside was gray. Not foggy, not cloudy, just gray. An endless stretch of colorless void where the street, the trees, the neighbors' houses should have been. He stumbled forward, reaching out into the gray, but within seconds he was back inside the living room, staring at his own front door. He tried again. The same thing happened. Each attempt spat him back into the house as if the front door no longer connected to the real world. The house had closed its mouth, and Daniel was inside it. From that day forward, time itself seemed to unravel. The clocks on the walls spun erratically, sometimes freezing, sometimes racing forward. Sunlight poured through the windows at midnight. Shadows stretched across the floor at noon. He no longer knew what day it was or if days even existed anymore. The rooms began to change as well. He'd walk into the kitchen only to find it wasn't the kitchen anymore, it was the hallway. The door to the bathroom sometimes led to the attic. Sometimes the stairs stretched upward endlessly, leading to floors that had never existed before. He ran through the shifting corridors, screaming, clawing at doors that opened only to brick walls or endless black voids. One night, in his frantic wandering, Daniel stumbled upon a room he had never seen before. It was small, barely big enough to stand in, and the walls were covered in scratches. Deep gouges, hundreds of them, layered over each other, as though countless hands had clawed desperately at the plaster. In the corner sat a pile of bones, human bones, yellowed with age. Some still had shreds of clothing clinging to them. Daniel fell to his knees, gagging, when he noticed something worse. The bones weren't old. Some of them were fresh. And among them was a shirt he recognized. It was his shirt. The same one he had lost a week ago and assumed had been misplaced. Except this version was torn, bloodied, and stained with something dark. He stumbled back, shaking his head violently, whispering, "No, no, this can't be me. This can't be me." The house groaned in response, the walls quivering as though amused. That night, Daniel dreamed again, or perhaps he didn't. He stood in the middle of the living room, staring at his reflection in the window. Except it wasn't his reflection. The face staring back at him was pale, sunken, eyes wide and lifeless. Its lips curled into a smile Daniel couldn't replicate. And then, in the glass, his reflection moved without him. It lifted a hand, pressed it against the glass, and whispered words he couldn't hear. When he woke, his own handprint was smeared across the inside of the window. By now, Daniel understood the truth. The house wasn't just haunting him. It was consuming him. It had swallowed his time, his sense of reality, and soon it would swallow his body and soul. The bones in the hidden room weren't strangers. They were all Daniel, different versions, different endings, all trapped in the same cycle. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The voices in his head grew louder, clearer, and more insistent. They no longer whispered. They commanded, "Stay, sleep, surrender." Daniel screamed back, smashing mirrors, tearing holes into the walls, but no matter how he fought, the house remained unbroken. His fists bloodied against plaster, but the walls only pulsed faintly, like skin stretching over bone. And then one night, as Daniel stumbled through the maze of shifting rooms, the house finally spoke in its own voice. Not whispers, not scratching, not shadows. A deep, guttural rumble that came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floor, the walls, even inside Daniel's chest. "You are mine now." The lights flickered. The doors slammed shut. The floor beneath him began to crack open, revealing only darkness below. Daniel tried to run, but every door led back into the same room. He was trapped in an endless loop, circling, until his legs gave out and he collapsed onto the floor. The last thing he saw before blacking out was the ceiling above him bending downward, stretching unnaturally, as though the house itself was leaning closer to swallow him whole. Daniel no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming. The house had erased the line between the two. Days didn't pass anymore. There were only moments of terror, stretched endlessly, like a scream that never stopped echoing. His body had grown thin and weak. His skin was pale, his hands trembling. He had stopped eating days ago, maybe weeks, he couldn't tell. Food rotted before his eyes, water tasted like dust. It was as if the house wanted him hollow, emptied, ready. That night, the final night, the whispers didn't come at 3 a.m. as usual. They came early. They filled every corner of the house, so loud and clear that Daniel could finally understand them. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all layered on top of each other, speaking in perfect unison. "Sleep now, Daniel. We are waiting." He tried to resist. He pressed his palms over his ears, stumbled from room to room, but the voices followed him everywhere. The air grew heavy, suffocating, until breathing felt like drowning. His vision blurred, his body weakened, and still the voices chanted, "Sleep, sleep, sleep." Daniel collapsed in the hallway, his body shaking violently. The floorboards beneath him split open, and from the cracks, black hands began to emerge. Dozens of them, stretching and curling, pulling at his arms, his legs, his chest. He screamed, clawing at the floor, but the wood splintered in his hands like flesh. The house had him. The walls began to close in, bending and groaning, the ceiling lowering as though the entire structure was folding inward to swallow him. The windows shattered, but outside there was no world, only endless black. The voices rose to a deafening roar, the sound of countless souls trapped inside, chanting as one. Daniel was dragged downward into the floor. His fingernails tore off as he clawed desperately, leaving bloody streaks across the boards. His scream was cut short as the darkness enveloped him, pulling him into the house's hollow belly. And then silence. The house returned to stillness as if nothing had happened. The cracks in the floor sealed shut. The hallway looked untouched. Daniel was gone. For days, weeks, maybe years, the house stood empty. Dust settled over furniture. Cobwebs grew in corners. From the outside, it looked abandoned, lifeless. But inside, deep within its walls, faint whispers lingered. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind outside was still, you could hear a new voice among them. A voice screaming endlessly. A voice calling for help. Daniel's voice. The house had claimed another. And it was waiting patiently for the next one. To this day, no one knows what truly became of Daniel. Some say he vanished without a trace. Others believe the house itself swallowed him whole. But if you ever find yourself passing by an old, forgotten home, one that seems too quiet, too still, listen closely. You might hear the whispers in the walls. And if you do, don't go inside.